I'm Bonnie Andrews. I am head of product at Totaljobs, and I've been working in the online recruitment industry for nearly 20 years now. And today I want to talk to you about the concept of Imposter Phenomenon, or IP, which is going to be much easier for me to say throughout the rest of the presentation. I want to talk about what we mean by IP, what the signs are, and give you some practical advice on how you can tackle this feeling that grips many of us in our work lives, but particularly individuals who are likely to be seen in a minority at work. And what I'm also going to be doing is considering how, as employers, we can foster a more inclusive and diverse workforce, where everyone feels welcome, everyone feels involved and represented at all levels, with a bid to help tackle imposter phenomenon. Now, obviously you're all here today because you see the importance of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And McKinsey published a report back in January last year that highlights that making our workplaces more representative is not only morally and politically the right thing to do, it makes absolute business sense. Now, their research has shown that ultimately companies who are more gender and ethnically diverse are more profitable. And this is due to increased innovation, critical thinking, problem-solving ability that comes when you have a range of different people at the table. Now, they've shown that businesses in the top quartile of gender diversity on executive teams are 21% more likely to experience above-average profits. And businesses in the top quartile for ethnic diversity on executive teams are 33% more likely to experience above-average profits. But those businesses who are in the bottom quartile for both gender and ethnic diversity are 29% more likely to receive less than above average profitability. Now, of course, diversity alone isn't enough. Diversity becomes inclusion when your people feel actively included in the business and that their opinions are valued and actively sought out. So at Totaljobs, we surveyed over 2,000 UK workers in February this year. And to conduct the research, we teamed up with two experts into imposter phenomenon. Dr. Terry Simpkin, who's a lecturer in leadership and corporate education at Anglia Ruskin University, and she's researched into the prevalence of IP amongst women in the STEM industries. And also Kate Atkin, who's a professional speaker and a coach, and she studied the phenomenon as a MSc. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Have you ever heard yourself thinking, or maybe heard others saying things like, "Praise makes me uncomfortable"? When someone gives me a compliment, I often feel unable to accept it, or I have to justify it. I often worry about being found out because I think I'm not as good as people think I am. Or if I do something well, I'm sure others can do the same. Now, it's likely these may sound familiar to many of you, and if that's true, you're not alone. In fact, the majority of UK workers have experienced imposter phenomenon at some point in their careers. Now, while it affects many people at work, there are greater barriers from those who are in minority groups when it comes to progression at work and feeling included and valued. So what we're going to do is look at the combination of imposter phenomenon and being in a minority background and how that can help impact employee well-being and how this interacts with the diversity and inclusion initiatives we have at our businesses. But first, let's talk about what we actually mean by imposter phenomenon. You've likely heard it more as imposter syndrome, but in psychological terms, it's more accurately known as imposter phenomenon. It's an internal feeling of intellectual phoniness. This is because it's defined as an experience that isn't constant, but instead it arises in certain situations, and it most often at work, but it is not a mental health condition. So IP it's an internal sense of this intellectual fraudulence, despite evidence to the contrary. So it's more than your normal self-doubt, which is discomfort that typically can fade as you gain experience or you repeat doing something that makes you uncomfortable or uneasy, like standing up and presenting to a group of people or talking to your manager about a pay rise. The key difference between self-doubt and IP is that IP exists despite a proven track record of your success and validation by others. So this is reflected in the fact that many in managerial positions experience imposter phenomenon. So we've seen from our research that junior managers are slightly more likely to experience this, but even 68% of the people we surveyed who were senior managers have also said they felt like an imposter at times. Now, this highlights that IP comes back to bite you, no matter how successful you are in your career. And it's often felt by high-achieving people who can't recognize their own success or their capabilities. It's kind of like a blind spot of sorts. And this is paired with a persistent feeling of a fear of failure or a fear of being found out. It boils down to not feeling worthy of your success, not feeling good enough generally. And as a result, people may feel high stress, anxiety, depression. They may even move into burnout because of experience in IP. Now, of course, poor employee mental well-being has implications for output and means that people are more likely to procrastinate at work or maybe not even turn up at work. Now, we all want productive, happy workforce, so it's our duty of care as employers to ensure that we can create the right environment and raise our own understanding to make this possible. So our research has shown that actually there is a disparity in who feels the effects of IP more. So generally, our research showed that women are more likely to experience the effects of imposter phenomenon, 75% of the women we surveyed. Now, when the phenomenon was first noted by clinical psychologists Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes in 1978, they noticed that some high-achieving women actually believed their success was down to luck, or that somehow they'd fooled others and they felt unworthy of their own success. But our research has shown that also others do experience imposter phenomenon. 77% of people from the LGBTQ+ community have said they've experienced it, and 62% of people from ethnic minority backgrounds have also experienced it. And then when we delved deeper and looked at the ages of these different groups, we could see that actually the younger generations are also now more likely to experience it. So we saw that 74% of millennials, so those born between kind of mid-1990s to mid-2000s, experienced it. 71% of Generation Xers, born kind of mid-60s to early 1980s, compared to 63% of baby boomers who were born kind of 40s to 60s. Now, everyone who experiences this feels it in for a multitude of ways, very nuanced reasons. But generally, those who are more likely to experience it are likely to be considered for a minority within the workforce. And when an individual themselves is in a situation at work when there isn't anyone else who is the same gender or the same ethnicity as them, imposter phenomenon is likely to be experienced as they themselves believe that this is evidence, because they're the only one, that they're not worthy of being in the position, that they're not meant to be there. So consider this: if there is one lone woman on a board of directors, she may have an internal monologue along the lines of, how did I get here? Why me? How do other people think did I get here? Do I belong here? Can I do this? Because when an individual is in the minority, imposter feelings can be felt far more acutely. Now, Kevin Coakley, who's a professor at the University of Texas, he took a study into the links between what he called imposterism and students who belong to minority groups. And his findings suggest that this lack of representation can make the minority groups feel like outsiders. And this creates more stress and anxiety when it's coupled with feelings of imposterism. And his findings show that the effects of poor mental health as a result of experiencing imposterism are likely to occur more in minorities due to a lack of inclusion and representation across businesses. And when we now look at this in the context of the workplace, we see that diversity and inclusion is becoming far more transparent and solutions-focused. And at Totaljobs, when we've spoken to employers about the initiatives that they're involved in, they've included things like actively promoting underrepresented individuals, making progression paths clearer, offering more training opportunities, and launching diversity networks. Companies may also now share publicly their diversity-based targets, just like they do with the Gender Pay Gap report. And these are all really good steps in the right direction to a more representative and inclusive and fair workforce. But consider this: a company pledges to have a more balanced board, and in order to be more representative of its workforce, so they hire an ethnically Asian female candidate to the board. It's not difficult in that situation to imagine that she may think that she's there as a token, as opposed to a result of her skills and her experience. Now, the answer here obviously isn't to stop promoting people who are the best suited to their roles, absolutely not, or to stop engaging in the conversations around the barriers to entry for certain groups. But what we're saying is it's important to remember that while these initiatives are important, they can have the ability to unintentionally impact the way these individuals see themselves. So we need to be aware of this and make sure that we can objectively reiterate the value an individual brings to the team. We can almost see this as a kind of unconscious or implicit bias, but against yourself, because it comes with the added challenge of feeling like you have to do better than those in the majority in order to be able to navigate the social structures and political workplace policies in order to prove your worth. So these individuals may feel they have to work harder to be seen and heard than the majority. Now, for many, IP also may have roots in our early upbringing. Our experiences impact how we perceive ourselves and how we think others perceive us in return. And that may have a certain experiences we may see as confirming our feelings of not being good enough or not belonging in this particular space. And from personal experience, I know exactly how that feels like. I was raised with 3 much older brothers who were academically excellent. They're now all doctors. One is a reader in the history of psychology. One is a consultant cardiologist, and one is a professor of microbiology. I am not joking. I came along 10 years later. 10 years later. And my grades just did not stack up to this excellent track record that these men had achieved. And it was quite obvious to my parents that I was, particularly my mother, that I just wouldn't get the grades to go to university. And in fact, my mum's main expectation was that I would get married and have babies. Now, I'm not married, I don't have babies, but I did get to university and I did get a 2-1 in business. But despite that, because of this early upbringing, this feeling that I'm not as good as them, it has plagued me. So it meant that when I went into business early on, I just felt I wasn't as clever as other people, particularly when they went to Oxford or Cambridge or a proper college and not a polytechnic, which I went to and became a university. And it has followed me. Now, I'm aware of it, but I now consider it a kind of gremlin that follows me. So I'm aware of it and I have much more armory to deal with it, but it still can rear its head. Now, the reasonings other people may experience IP are varied and complex, but there are certain kind of mindsets or phrases that can be a sign. So the most common effect is that individuals allow colleagues to take credit for projects or successes that they've been involved in. 70% of the people we surveyed. And just over half of the people said that they feel uncomfortable when they receive recognition for their good work. And around 40% said they feel they failed to meet the expectations, or they're even staying in a job that they don't think they're very good at because they don't think they'll succeed somewhere else. And a third say they feel anxious. Now, we can summarize these kinds of feelings of doubtfulness, of fear, of fake, being unworthy, guilty, or lucky. And if you compare this to those who don't suffer the effects of IP, it highlights the real differences. Because these people feel confident, they feel proud, they feel deserving of their achievements and their successes at work. While those who don't have these feelings, they find it really difficult to build up their sense of confidence and security in their work selves, no matter what praise or successes they've had because of their hard work. And these unhealthy feelings are echoed in the way those people who are experiencing IP react to setbacks or failures at work. Because when it comes to experiencing failures, those with IP will feel these setbacks to a much greater extent than they feel the pride or a sense of accomplishment that others associate with success. Now, the mistake that they make may often seem much bigger than it really was, leading to a far greater feeling of failure when they approach other tasks in the future. So to compensate for this, many of them will set themselves really high expectations and high personal standards. They'll look to exceed expectations of what can be delivered. But then this becomes a vicious cycle because they have a fear of failure, which leads to this imposed, increased expectation, which leads to a greater chance of actually failing, due to aiming for a level of perfection that is just unattainable. So this determination to push yourself can be detrimental to people's mental health and leads to increased stress and anxiety about your worth and your role at work. And of course, this has really negative implications, not just for the individual, but of course for businesses. So tackling IP is a multi-pronged approach. It's one that relies on businesses to continue their dedication to being representative in order to help alleviate the effects that it has on individuals, particularly those with minority backgrounds. So on a team level, it may help to define and discuss imposter phenomenon and its implications if you've noticed some of the signs that we talked of earlier from individuals in your team. Because shrugging it off as just, oh, they've got some self-doubt, may lead to dismissing its true effects as unimportant. Now, an obvious suggestion of how to help might be to make sure that you make extra effort to acknowledge the achievements of your team. However, it's not as simple as that, because one of the distinguishers of IP is that those people who feel it just don't think they're good enough. They can't accept the praise, and they do this because they genuinely don't think it was down to their qualities or their skill set. So by pairing your team members up with potentially members outside of their team, they could start to learn how to objectively highlight the impact they have within the business to someone who may not know what their own responsibilities are, which might help shift the personal perceptions of their achievements. Now, you can encourage your team to basically recognize their own strengths by objectively getting them to highlight their key personal strengths and how these help contribute to the business success. So those experiencing IP can clearly see the targets that they've hit. And then when it comes to feedback, it's very important to consider the needs of the individual. So don't assume that they want to receive praise or feedback in a particular way. It's important to ask them what they find most useful. Likewise, recognize the way your team tackles stress or challenging projects. So if the individual is procrastinating about delivering a project or overthinking the potential pitfalls, have a gentle conversation with them about why that is. Set clear expectations, what's good enough, so they have a benchmark to work towards. Similarly, if you know that someone is struggling to accept praise, gently call it out and highlight why the praise is warranted. In fact, evidence has shown that public illustrations of praise might have a negative impact on those who are experiencing imposter phenomenon because it heightens that sense of pressure and anxiety surrounding how others are perceiving them. When it comes back to feedback in general, those feelings of people who've got imposter feelings may benefit from feedback that is objectively highlighting what they've achieved, what strengths have been improved, and other evidence on how they've performed their role. It will help alleviate that stress. And by providing this to the individuals, you can help make them a step towards taking pride in their success and them feeling deserving of the praise that they're getting. But also having a strong learning and development offering is beneficial, as individuals are more likely to be empowered when they're continually learning, and the completion of a training course or a qualification might help them see objective evidence of their progression. You could also consider project checklists or the opportunity for individuals to self-assess themselves following a project so that you can understand how their perception of their performance differs to your own. And you can also refer back to the job description, ensuring that it is clear and highlights the role requirements so that the individual can see how their role has progressed. Now, we need to consider how the diversity initiatives I raised at the start of the presentation interact with an individual's imposter phenomenon and how employees can tackle this on a wider scale as opposed to just on a kind of line management employee basis. Now, I mentioned some of the initiatives that employers are undertaking to make their businesses more diverse and inclusive. And our research into the gender pay gap back last year found that 33% of employers are training staff on unconscious bias. We saw that 27% of employers are reviewing their salaries, and we saw that 26% are actively hiring female candidates into senior or leadership roles as a result of their gender pay gap finding. And we need to make sure this level of awareness and this approach is taken across the board, not just when we're thinking about gender in mind. So inclusion initiatives that allow individuals to network with others that they can relate to and identify with are a really powerful tool to help create an environment that respects the input of all the voices and helps people from all backgrounds feel as though they're not the only one and they are represented within the business, but also that their perspectives are actively sought out and valued equally. Those from a minority background we found are, unsurprisingly, more likely to see a lack of diversity in management and senior positions as a barrier to their progression. 27% of ethnic minority workers feel this way, and a fifth of women believe the same. So these stats are actually taken from the Totaljobs diversity and inclusion research that we conducted in partnership with Robert Walters, and we'll launch the report later this month. As part of this report, we wanted to understand the most common initiatives that employers were undertaking as part of their inclusion and diversity programs, and what employers thought were helpful. What's great is that almost half of the employees see diversity networks as a benefit to employees. And over half of ethnic minorities believe diversity networks are beneficial. But 41% of professionals state their current employer doesn't have a diversity network in place. And a further 31% state they're unsure if they have one in place at all. So it's key that as employers we actively promote these kinds of initiatives internally in order to make sure that they are as beneficial to our employees as possible. And also as individuals we can start to interrogate our thoughts in a bid to silence those feelings of imposterism. Now, overall, IP is something that can be felt by a wide variety of people, particularly in the workplace. However, being in the minority at work, unfortunately, makes it far more likely that you will have this feeling of fraudulence and ultimately have a lack of confidence in your own abilities. And as I've explored previously, the reasons behind this is complex and nuanced, but the key things to remember are that managers can help tackle IP with their teams by understanding what kind of feedback is most beneficial to the individuals. And usually it's that which involves kind of objective, evidence-based, evidence of a job well done. And as individuals, as I said, we can start to interrogate our own thoughts and silence that voice when it starts to tell us that we're an imposter. And ultimately, these individual methods can only be fruitful if the businesses themselves are committed to ensuring their workforces are represented at all levels and that people feel as though they are valued because of their unique offering to the business, which is where diversity moves to real inclusion. And finally, make sure that you understand the perceptions of your workforce when it comes to diversity and inclusion efforts. Fostering an environment where everyone feels welcomed and valued is essential. For many, diversity networks at work have their place, so create one that's fit for purpose, making a conscious effort to understand the needs and the potential barriers of employees within your business. Thank you very much.